speakers today, I want to start out by introducing Loren Horton. He received his degrees from UNI, a PhD from the University of Iowa. He taught history for many years. He worked in this building for 24 years. Many of you know him as a popular speaker in our community and elsewhere in the state, and he's written numerous times for our magazine, The Palimpsest and the Iowa Heritage Illustrated. We're really glad to have Loren back here today. I also want to make note of Ina Loewenberg. She spoke here a year ago about a book that she did called The View from 70, Women's Recollections and Reflections. And those women came here when they were 80 to review that story that they had told in that book. Ina Loewenberg's been a philosophy teacher, tax preparer, internal auditor, and photographer. She now leads a poetry reading group, Reading Out Loud, at the Iowa City Senior Center, and we're honored to have them here with us today. Join me in welcoming the Poetry Out Loud group, Ina Loewenberg, and the infamous Loren Horton.
Thank you, Mary. Our name is Reading Aloud, actually. It's all right. It's all right. And we are based at the wonderful Iowa City Senior Center. Usually, when reading aloud, all these fine readers dressed in black, usually when we give a program, we simply read poems, and that's all there is to it. But today we have a program called History at Lunch, and so it's very fortunate that we decided, before we knew that title, to collaborate with Loren Horton so that you will not only hear the poems we read, but you will learn about the poets who wrote those poems, and I hope that that will be an enriched experience for you. I also want to say that it's a privilege to read in this beautiful room, in this wonderful facility, which is now so sadly under siege. And I hope that those of us who care about the State Historical Society will raise our voices to be heard that what Des Moines wants shouldn't happen. Anyway, thank you very much, and now we'll begin the program, and please hold your applause until the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for a nice introduction. Thank you, Ina, for beginning this program, and welcome to all of you who came to hear the program. Before we actually begin to hear poetry read, and before we hear about the poets who wrote that poetry, I thought it might be a good idea to talk about the impact of World War I in terms of lives of human beings. All but one of the poems you're going to hear today was written by an Englishman, British, if you prefer that term. The other one being a Canadian, part at that time of the British Empire. But at any rate, World War I began on the 28th of July, 1914, and it was over, as we all know, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, November the 11th, 1918. During that time, the number of troops from the British Empire that were involved in fighting amounted to 8,689,467. It's a very precise number. I assume it's accurate. The total number of men and some women, but not many women, who died of all causes during that period of time that I just encompassed there was 956,703. That is a horrendous death rate. I have the figures for the other countries, but we're mainly concerned with what we'll call England, for want of saying the United Kingdom of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland. It takes too long. The estimated number of people who died during the war, I should rephrase that, the number of people throughout the world who were killed in action during World War I was 6,537,703. The number who were wounded was 19,137,998. This is an enormous number of people to be killed and wounded, And that does not even take into account those who had what was called at the time shell shock, which now we call something else, but it affected people at the time and for long after in very profound ways. Well, let us proceed then to the reading of poems. The first poem you're going to hear was written by a man named Rupert Brooke. Brooke was born in Rugby, England. He grew up in a household that valued education. His father was a housemaster at Rugby School, where indeed young Rupert and his two brothers both went to school. Brooke then took a degree from King's College, Cambridge, where he distinguished himself in literature, in dramatics, and in athletics. It's not always that you find somebody who is good in all of those things, but he won prizes for his poetry and also for his skill in the games, as they called them, in athletic contests. He was associated at Cambridge and afterwards with a coterie of well-known poets, actors, writers, musicians, and politicians, including one of his very close friends, Winston Churchill. In other words, he moved in high society and high political circles, and keep that in mind. Several of his contemporaries described him, and this is in writing, things that they wrote about him, that he was, and I quote, the handsomest man in England, end of quotation. You will have to determine whether that affected the quality of his poetry or not. Brooke enlisted on the 3rd of August, 1914, which is just about as quickly as you can enlist in that particular war. He was commissioned a sub-lieutenant, I think that's an interesting military title, in the Royal Navy. And he saw action on the Western Front in the Battle of Antwerp. So he did indeed see combat action in the war. He was then ordered, his unit, to the Eastern Mediterranean theater of operations. And while he was aboard a ship heading for the Gallipoli invasion, which would be near Constantinople, Istanbul, he died of septicemia on the 23rd of April, 1915. He was buried on a nearby island because they couldn't take a dead body along with them. The island of Skyros, and his tomb there, his gravesite, monument was erected over it later, is still kind of a place where fans of his poetry go together. Between the time of the Battle of Antwerp and his death on the way to the Gallipoli invasion, he wrote his famous 1914 sonnets, and you're going to hear one of those today. This was, without a doubt, the most widely published and the most well-known poem during the first year or two of World War I. Not only was it printed in the London Times, but it was also read aloud in the House of Commons. And we who write poetry wish we could have that much fame.
The Soldier by Rupert Brooke. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven.
The next poem is by Robert Ernest Vernade, not nearly as well known as Rupert Brooke, but a very fine poet in his own right. He was born in London, educated at St. Paul's School and then at St. John's College, Oxford. You will note a consistency through here of the poets who went to what were in England are called public schools, the preparatory schools, and then went to either Oxford or Cambridge. Most of them were in that category. Robert Vernade was 39 years old when the war began, and it was a requirement in the British Army not to take anybody over the age of 35. However, they accepted him as a private in the Royal Fusiliers because the authorities supposedly misread the paperwork and thought it said 35 instead of 39. You may believe that if you wish. Later, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Rifle Brigade. Vernade was wounded in the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the first major battles of the war, and then he was killed later in the Battle of Havrincourt. Although he wrote considerable poetry before and during the war, he is probably best known for his novels and his short stories.
A Petition by Robert Ernest Vernade. All that a man might ask thou hast given me, England, birthright, and happy childhood's long heart's ease, and love whose range is deep beyond all sounding and wider than all seas. A heart to front the world and find God in it, eyes blind enow, but not too blind to see the lovely things behind the dross and darkness, and lovelier things to be. And friends whose loyalty time nor death shall weaken, and quenchless hope and laughter's gold store. All that a man might ask thou hast given me, England, yet grant thou one thing more. That now when envious foes should spoil thy splendor, unversed in arms, a dreamer such as I, may in thy ranks be deemed not all unworthy, England, for thee to die.
It is sometimes thought that had to be a man to be killed in the combat zone in World War I, and that is not true. The next poem is by a woman. She did not die in the combat zone, but many women did. They worked for what was called the VAD, the Volunteer Army Detachment, and they worked as nurses in hospital tents. They worked in Red Cross tents and so on. Marjorie Harriet Lawrence did not actually ever enter the combat zone, but she wrote a poem about it anyway. She was born in Wolverhampton, Staffordshire in 1889, and she died in 1969. Indeed, a long life for the time. She was married to a man named Arthur E. Towle, and much of her writing is as Marjorie Towle, not Marjorie Lawrence. She was most noted for writing romance fiction, fantasy fiction, and horror fiction, and she published very, very widely in all of those fields. She lived in Bloomsbury and was noted for her bohemian lifestyle. She indeed also was a painter and also a musician. Now, in addition to the poem you're going to hear, The Lost Army, she also wrote one other poem that I've been able to find about World War I that has the catchy title, Transport of Wounded in Mesopotamia in 1917.
The Lost Army by Marjorie Lawrence. Written after news of 250 men and 16 officers lost in a battle in 1916. Singing and shouting, they swept to the treasurer's forest. Darkness and silence received them and smothered their pain. Darkness and silence and night is the end of their story. They came not again. Never a hero came forth of the legions that entered, never cry nor prayer, nor a song of the brave. Dark in silence, the sinister forest received them and make them a grave. Somewhere deep down in the heart of the wood that betray them, shoulder to shoulder they lie, with the wounds to the fore. There in the dark and the silence they sleep, the lost army returning no more. We may not hear of their valor, their death, or their glory. Nay, they were ours, and they died for their country. And so, darkness and silence and night is the end of the story. All we need know.
The next set of poems were written by a young man named Wilfred Edward Salter Owen. He is counted by most literary critics to be one of the 4 or 5 best and greatest poets of World War I. He was killed in action on the 4th of November, 1918, 1 week before the armistice was signed. There's a legend abroad about him that in his hometown of Shrewsbury, at the time the church bells were ringing to celebrate the end of the war, his parents received the telegram announcing his death. There is no documentary evidence that that actually happened, but it is a story that grew up around him because he was quite beloved, both by troops and by the general public. One of the momentous events of World War I from a literary point of view was the day when Wilfred Owen gathered enough courage to speak to Siegfried Sassoon, who was the most famous poet at the time. The meeting took place in Craig Lockhart Military Hospital, where Owen was a patient to recover from shell shock and other wounds that he had received in action. We'll hear more a little bit later about why Siegfried Sassoon was in Craig Lockhart Military Hospital. The meeting took place precisely, we know, because of the diaries and letters of both men, on the 17th of August, 1917. Owen gathered up enough courage to show Sassoon some of his poems. Sassoon actually encouraged him, although he suggested that Owen write in a more direct and perhaps a more colloquial style, the style that Owen had mostly characterized up to that time was a sort of a heroic style, an epic style. At any rate, Sassoon did encourage him, and together they worked on a literary journal that was published in the hospital called The Hydra, and they both had poems published in that journal. Under Sassoon's influence, Owen's style did change dramatically, and you're going to hear only poems written in the style after the influence of Sassoon has come about. Anyway, his memories of the battles that he was in and the military adventures and horror that he saw are channeled into some of what I consider his greatest poems. A testament of the friendship of the two men is found in the final manuscript of the poem Anthem for Doomed Youth, which you're going to hear today, which contains suggestions written in Sassoon's own handwriting on Owen's draft of the poem. On the 25th of September, 1917, Owen wrote to his mother, quote, "I send you two of my best war poems." Sassoon supplied the title Anthem, which is exactly what I meant it to be, end of quote.
Dulce et decorum est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rests began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.
The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, also by Wilfred Owen. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him, and a knife. And as they sojourned, both of them together, Isaac, the firstborn, spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him thy son. Behold, caught in a thicket by its horns, a ram. Offer the ram of pride instead. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one.
Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes now shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk of drawing down of blinds.
Hopefully you can see quite easily the realism of combat coming out in his poems. The next poet that you're going to hear from is a young man named Isaac Rosenberg, who is somewhat unique within the group that we're hearing from today. He stands out among most of them because, for one thing, he never rose above the rank of private. He was constantly being reassigned from one unit to another, and this was not a complimentary nor a good thing. None of his units that he was ever assigned to did he fit in easily or basically fit in at all. One of his commanding officers reported that these repeated transfers were, quote, a symptom of his unsoldierliness, end of quotation. Rosenberg enlisted in September of 1915, and you'll remember the maximum age requirement was 35 years, yet they took somebody who was 39. Well, the minimum height requirement was 5 feet 3 inches. Isaac Rosenberg was not that tall. However, the casualty rates in the first few battles of the war were so horrendous that they needed troops. So they not only took men who were older than they were supposed to be, but they took men who were shorter than they were supposed to be. They lumped all of these men who were under 5 feet 3 inches tall into a unit that they called the Bantam Battalion. In August of 1916, Rosenberg wrote to a man named Sir Edward Marsh, and we don't have time to describe him today, but he was a patron of painters, of poets, of other men and women of culture, and he kept up a correspondence with many of the people that you're hearing poems written by today. Anyway, he wrote to Marsh and said, quote, I have been forbidden to send poems home, as the censor says he won't be bothered with going through such rubbish, end of quotation. In February 1918, he wrote to another friend, quote, all the poetry has gone quite out of me, end of quotation. His problems stemmed from multiple factors. He had lung problems that left him susceptible to pneumonia and to influenza. He was very thin. In fact, he's described by several people as being scrawny. He was Jewish and suffered from the anti-Semitism that was in the army at the time. He had grown up in Whitechapel, an East End slum in London, and so he had absolutely nothing in common with people from any other part of England, regardless of their education or anything like that. He was bullied continually, both by his fellow troops and also by the officers, frequently sentenced to company punishment. This must have been a horrible life for him. And the fact that he had attended Birkbeck College of Art and the Slade School of Art, he had exhibited paintings in galleries and in shows, meant nothing to them. He had also had poems published before the war. None of this made any difference. Rosenberg was killed in action on the 1st of April, 1918.
Break of Day in the Trenches by Isaac Rosenberg. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer, sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand. You will do the same to a German, soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass, strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chanced than you for life. Bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes at the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver? What heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in men's veins drop and are ever dropping. But mine is safe in my ear, just a little white with the dust.
I would just like to insert a parenthesis here. You may notice that we are wearing paper poppies. Apparently you can't get real or fake ones anymore, but Michael Chan, our member, made these for us, and we are wearing them as symbols of World War I.
Thank you, Ina. The poppy was a common field flower in Flanders and the areas where the fighting was going on, and so they saw lots of poppies, and they bloomed as sort of in the neighborhood like dandelions would here. The next poet you're going to hear an example from is Robert Malise Bouyer Nichols. Nichols was one of the lucky English poets. He survived World War I. He left Trinity College, Oxford in 1914 to enlist in the Army, where he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Royal Field Artillery, and he was immediately sent to the front. And I'll pause here and point out that young men, 18, 19 years old, enlisted. Many cases, if they had prep school or university backgrounds, they were commissioned and they were sent to the front almost as quickly as I just said those words, with training that didn't even deserve the word training in it. At any rate, in 1916, he was invalided back to England, and that was the term at the time when you were wounded. You were sent back, and it was called being invalided. He was suffering from shell shock, and he never went back to the front, although he continued to write poetry about his experiences when he was in combat. In 1917 and 1918, he had an interesting job. He served as a member of an official British propaganda mission to the United States, where he did poetry readings throughout this country. During the rest of his life, he wrote many, many, many books, poetry, plays, prose. He was just a very voluminous writer. He died during World War II in 1944.
Noon by Robert Nichols. It is midday. The deep trench glares, a buzz and blaze of flies. The hot wind puffs the giddy airs. The great sun rakes the skies. No sound
in all the stagnant trench where 40 standing men endure the sweat and grit and stench like cattle in a pen. Sometimes a sniper's bullet whirs or twangs the whining wire. Sometimes a soldier sighs and stirs as in hell's frying fire. From out a high, cool cloud descends an aeroplane's flower moon. The sun strikes down, the thin cloud rends, the black spot travels on. And sweating, dizzied, isolate, in the hot trench beneath, we bide the next shrewd move of fate, be it life or death.
The next poet you'll hear is Dame Edith Louisa Sitwell. She did not serve in a combat zone, but she nonetheless wrote about it from the descriptions that men she knew did send back, and one of her own brothers was in combat. Dame Edith Sitwell was the daughter of a baronet, and her mother was the daughter of an earl and the granddaughter of a duke. And I mention all of this to show you the aristocratic level at which we're working here. She had two brothers, one named Osbert and one named Sacheverell, and the three siblings were all very well-known literary figures throughout their entire lives. Although she wrote several notable poems during and about World War II, the selection you hear today, I think perhaps is the only one she wrote about World War I. She was also notable for her books about English queens. She wrote several of those. In 1957, Dame Edith Sitwell was confined to a wheelchair where she spent the rest of her life until she died on the 9th of December, 1977.
The Dancers by Edith Sitwell, written during a great battle, 1916. The floors are slippery with blood. The world gyrates too. God is good that while his wind blows out the light for those who hourly die for us, we still can dance each night. The music has grown numb with death, but we will suck their dying breath, the whispered name they breathe to chants, to swell our music, make it loud, that we may dance, may dance. We are the dull, blind carrion fly that dance and batten, though God die mad from the horror of the light is mad too, flecked with blood. We dance each night.
The next poet you're going to hear from is a man named Siegfried Sassoon. And I'm going to tell you more about him than I have about any of the others. And there are two or three reasons for that. One is I want to. Another one is there's more material available about him because he wrote a 3-volume autobiography and kept all of his diaries from his life, so there's lots of material. And the third possible reason is because he is by most critics considered to be the greatest poet of World War I. That's of course always a matter of opinion, but it is generally accepted. Sassoon was born in Kent in 1886, the second of three sons of a very wealthy businessman, very, very wealthy businessman. Sassoon's mother was Georgiana Thornycroft, who was the daughter of two artists, was an artist herself, and after the father's death, Sassoon grew up in a home that could only be considered very privileged and very cultured and very wealthy. He was educated at Marlborough School and at Clare College, Cambridge, although he left without taking a degree. After university, Sassoon spent the next few years, about 7 years in fact, in the life of a country gentleman, something that we might all aspire to if we had wealthy fathers and artistic mothers. According to the diaries, the descriptions, and the newspaper articles about the house parties, he spent his days in hunting, in playing golf, in horseback riding, in playing polo, in playing cricket, and also in writing poetry, which he self-published, printed privately. Actually, this early poetry of Siegfried Sassoon's largely went unnoticed by the critics and totally unnoticed by the public. It's not a reflection of the quality of it, it's just that he didn't circulate the privately printed books very much. In 1914, when the war broke out, Sassoon enlisted in the Sussex Yeomanry, which was a cavalry unit, and it is apparent, both from his own words and others, that he did that so that he would have control of the horses that he owned and they would not be conscripted into the British Army and used otherwise, because they drafted horses as well as drafted men during the war. By May 1915, he was commissioned an officer in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. You will notice quite a number of these poets have either a service in or commissions in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. You should not imagine that that unit had necessarily much to do with Wales, even though it's called that. Anyway, almost immediately and with virtually no training, he also was sent to the war front. Now, his early wartime poetry shows a very strong patriotic bent. It's the heroic kind of thing that he later advised Owen not to write. However, Sassoon's attitude towards the war changed greatly, mostly apparently because of two things. One, his younger brother Hamo was killed in the Gallipoli invasion, and he resented that. And then in February 1916, a young man named Lieutenant David Cuthbert Thomas was killed in action. Well, it just so happens that Sassoon and Thomas had been homosexual partners since their years at Cambridge together. So these two deaths affected him greatly, and it removed any positive feeling that he had about the war. His subsequent poetry shows not only blunt realism, but also a sort of a contempt for the way the war was being fought. He distrusted the generals in charge of the high command and their mastery of strategy. To say distrusted it is putting it mildly. He was by this time a captain, and he began to behave very recklessly and dangerously in combat. He was considered by his troops to be a hero because he charged with them. He sometimes charged ahead of them and without them, and generally just was out in where things were happening. In June 1916, Sassoon was awarded the Military Cross for bravery in action for going into no man's land, the land in between the British trenches and the German trenches, and carrying a wounded soldier back to the English trenches under heavy German fire the whole time. The Military Cross is the fourth highest medal awarded in the British Army. For this and for many other incidents like that, I mean, there's just repetitive incidents like this, he got the nickname from his own unit, Mad Jack. That was a complimentary nickname. Later on, for single-handedly capturing a German trench section, he was recommended for the Victoria Cross, which is the highest medal awarded in the British Army. The High Command nixed that recommendation for two reasons. They just couldn't bear it because here is a captain, a decorated officer, but he's a homosexual and he's Jewish. And so he didn't ever get the Victoria Cross. In June 1917, Sassoon was wounded by sniper fire in battle, and he was invalided back to England, or as they called it, whenever they got a wound that was serious enough that they'd be sent back to England, they called it returning to Blighty. So he got a return to Blighty. While recovering from these wounds, he wrote his famous Soldier's Declaration. He did that in July of 1917. In it, he criticized Parliament, the rest of the government, the War Office, the military high command, and he criticized them all for the conduct of the war, for their jingoism, for lying, for being incompetent, for being obstinate, and for being overall stupid. Now, normally you don't say things like this about the government and the Army when you're in the Army. In fact, the very fact that he issued this to his own commanding officer and said, "I am not going back to fight," treasonous offense for which he could have been executed. But authorities realized that they were dealing with an aristocratic man, a wealthy man, a decorated officer who had been wounded in combat, and they were afraid to do much to him because of the adverse publicity that would result. Besides that, Sassoon had friends in high office, again, including Winston Churchill, but more to the point here was a fellow officer named Robert Graves, who was very highly placed politically and socially as well. Well, together, his friends convinced the War Office that what they should do was rig a medical board to say that Sassoon was suffering from shell shock and didn't know what he was doing when he wrote this Soldier's Declaration. That is indeed what they did do. And they then committed him to the Craig Lockhart Military Hospital, which was a mental hospital, although they always referred to it as a convalescent hospital. Anyway, they got him out of the way and out of the public eye. But in the meantime, his declaration, Soldier's Declaration, had been published in several newspapers, including the London Times, and it was also read aloud in the House of Commons, so it got very wide publicity anyway. Well, Sassoon's stay in the mental hospital was fortuitous for two reasons. Number one, it kept him from being executed for treason. And number two, he met and befriended Wilfred Owen, and between the two of them, they produced wonderful, wonderful poetry. He encouraged Owen, and Owen wrote lots more, what I think, excellent poetry. We've heard today already some of the results of that friendship. Well, in November 1917, the Army decided they had spent enough money keeping him quiet, so they rigged another medical board which decided that he no longer had shell shock, and they sent him back to the front. Well, it was never explicitly stated, but I am reading pretty clearly between the lines that they just hoped that he'd behave recklessly again and be killed in combat, and then they'd be done with him. But in fact, that didn't happen. He was wounded again, and he was invalided back to England. He got another blighty, as it were, and the war ended before he could be sent back into combat. The rest of his life he spent a little more productively than he had those 7 years between college and the war. He wrote voluminously, he wrote a lot of poetry, he wrote a lot of prose, and he wrote his 3-volume autobiography. And just 2 years ago, his entire collection of diaries from his whole life have been released to the public. If any of you have a lot of spare cash, perhaps you would like to fund a trip to England by me to read his diaries. I would be willing to accept that. Later on in his life, he was awarded a Commander of the British Empire by the Queen in 1951. The Queen, by the King in 1951, excuse me. And the Queen's Medal for Poetry in 1957, and he finally got his college degree. He got an honorary doctorate of literature from Oxford in 1965. He died in 1967, considered by most literary critics to be the greatest poet of the Great War.
Okay. Dreamers by Siegfried Sassoon. Soldiers are citizens of death's gray land, drawing no dividend from time's tomorrow. In the great hour of destiny, they stand, each with his feuds and jealousies and sorrows. Soldiers are sworn to action. They must win some flaming, fatal climax with their lives. Soldiers are dreamers. When the guns begin, they think of firelit homes, clean beds, and wives. I see them in foul dugouts, gnawed by rats, and in the ruined trenches lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats, and mocked by hopeless longings to regain bank holidays and picture shows and spats and going to the office in the train. Base details. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the Roll of Honor. Poor young chap, I'd say, I used to know his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap. And when the war is done and youth's stone dead, I'd toddle safely home and die in bed.
Does it matter? By Siegfried Sassoon. Does it matter losing your legs? For people will always be kind, and you need not show that you mind when others come in after hunting to gobble their muffins and eggs. Does it matter losing your sight? There's such splendid work for the blind, and people will always be kind. As you sit on the terrace remembering and turning your face to the light. Do they matter, those dreams in the pit? You can drink and forget and be glad, and people won't say that you're mad, for they know that you fought for your country, and no one will worry a bit.
The next poet you're going to hear from is John McCrae. He was born and educated in Canada, and he wrote this poem in Flanders Field on the 2nd of May, 1915, while serving with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the Second Battle of Ypres. It is, without doubt, the most famous poem written in the latter half of World War I, and probably the one that most people know of at all.
In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunrise glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. Aftermath by Siegfried Sassoon. Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have rumbled on since those gag days, like traffic check a while at the crossing of city ways. And the haunted gap in your mind has filled with thoughts that flow like clouds in the lit heavens of life, and you're a man reprieved to go, taking your peaceful share of time with joy to spare, but the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget.
Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Bennett? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on the parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the front-line trench? And dawn coming, dirty white and chill with a hopeless rain? Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack, and the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then, as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads, those ashen gray masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay? Have you forgotten yet?
Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget.
The last poet that you will hear from today is from the United States, Stephen Vincent Benet, a 2 times Pulitzer Prize winner for his poetry on mostly historical themes.
(1935). All night they marched, the infantrymen under pack, but the hands gripping the rifles were naked bone, and the hollow pits of the eyes stared vacant and black when the moonlight shone. The gas mask lay like a blot on the empty chest. The slanting helmets were spattered with rust and mold, but they burrowed the hill for the machine gun nest as they had of old. And the guns rolled and the tanks, but there was no sound. Never the gasp or rustle of living men. where the skeletons strung their wire on disputed ground. I knew them then. It is 17 years, I cried. You must come no more. We know your names. We know that you are the dead. Must you march forever from France and the last blind war? Fool, from the next, they said.
We have a short coda to this program because during that terrible war, with all these impassioned poems being written, something else was happening. In all the arts, modernism was being born. Modernism that had different forms because these poems were mainly fairly traditional, the ones you've heard in form, and a different tone, undoubtedly influenced by the horrors of the war, but different. Ezra Pound was perhaps in poetry the midwife of modernism, an American living in England. A young T.S. Eliot, also an American living in England, was the protege of Pound. And Eliot wrote his poem, the famous poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, during the war, and it was published in Poetry Magazine in America in 1915. We have cannibalized this long poem and going to read you just a few parts of it to give you an idea of how things went then. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table.
Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo.
And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse.
I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid.
I grow old. I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think they will sing to me.
Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. That was quite an emotional journey through past, and I feel the sorrow of loss over these men's lives and women's lives and all the other subsequent wars that took away some of our treasured young people. We need to ask or thank you, these marvelous readers, for giving us goosebumps and making us think. So perhaps you'll stand when I read your name. Michael Chan, Jim, let's wait and applaud at the end. Jim Curry, Jonni Ellsworth, Chuck Felling, Mary Gutmann, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say that.
Right, say it either.
Pat Huff, Ida Loewenberg, Nancy Lynch, Cari Malone, Kathy Mitchell, Betty Norbeck, and again, for all the valuable insights, Loren Horton. Thank you very much.
watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.